And this is All in the Mind. Natasha Mitchell with you on Radio National, abc.net.au/rn. A warm welcome. You would have seen all the press coverage in recent years about the teenage brain, that it's a work in progress, that major structural changes are going on during adolescence, and that this explains why when we're teens, we're sometimes impulsive, risk-takers, emotional, explosive, you've got the picture. But is science in fact infantilising our teens, with serious consequences for us all? Today on the show, producer Anita Barrow investigates the making of the modern teenager. Myth or marvel?
Have you noticed any dramatic changes?
Yeah, gotten taller and getting new friends because going to high school. You know, I used to be more immature, in year 11, you're like, hey, and now you're 14, you kind of just grown up and got over that stuff. Yeah, like normal teenager.
What is a normal teenager, in your opinion?
Talking about girls a lot.
Teenagers are this strange, magical creation that only seems to have appeared in human beings. So many of the things which are uniquely human, we acquire those skills when we're teenagers, things like abstraction, very complex language use. Many of the things we see as the sort of adverse sides of teenagers, it's really them coming to terms with all these amazingly difficult things that humans do so well.
Robert Epstein, you go to any government health site from just about any Western country about teenagers, and there's inevitably discussion about the teenage brain being a work in progress, that they're not adults. Are we giving the parents the wrong message?
Oh, definitely, yes. The teenage brain message is for sure the wrong message. It's actually a fraudulent. The brain changes throughout life. It's always a work in progress, but it doesn't explain the way we are necessarily. And there's no question that the turmoil that we see among teens, which is quite considerable, by the way, is a turmoil that our culture has created, and that it's unnecessary for there to be this horrible, tumultuous time of life.
I find that very difficult to reconcile with our data and with much other data that show that there is a major reorganization of the brain during adolescence. Now, I'm not saying that culture does not have a profound influence on how the person develops, but to say that the state of adolescence is a myth, it just flies in the face of very hard evidence.
So, the stage is set for the scientific debate over what adolescence is and means, when that sweet tween in your life can suddenly transform. The awkward growth spurt, the hormones, the grunts and grumpiness, the risk and rebellion. You can understand why neuroscience has become so interested in the teenage brain. Mounting evidence suggests that a tumultuous reconstruction of your grey matter happens from puberty right throughout your teens.
Well, there's two major processes that are going on at that time. The first one is myelination, the connecting up of different parts of the brain with the myelinated fibres. Myelinated fibres are what's called the white matter in the brain.
And this makes messages much more efficient and information.
That's correct. The communication in the brain becomes much more efficient.
Psychologist Nicholas Allen is from the Origin Youth Health Research Centre, internationally acclaimed for their research and work with young people and their families.
So if we want to talk about something like emotions, the outcome of this process of myelination is that the parts of the brain that are involved in controlling and regulating emotions become much more clearly connected and efficiently connected to the parts of the brain that are involved in generating emotions. Until this process is fully mature, one would expect, and there is data to support this, that the adolescent is not as capable of regulating their emotions as is an adult. The other major developmental change that's occurring in the brain is changes to the volume of the cortex, which is the grey matter that's on the outside of the brain. It's a particularly important part of the brain because this is where a lot of the computation is done. And so what happens is grey matter increases in the developing brain until about the age of 13, so around about the time of puberty. And then it starts to decrease. during that second decade of life. And we believe that this is a sign that the brain, having established all these connections, all these synapses, is now starting to eliminate the ones that are not useful, so that the brain is becoming more specialised and more efficient at what it does in processing information and dealing with behaviour and so forth. So we can see this in a number of ways. We can do MRI scans where we actually look at anatomically at the thickness of these various structures, but then there are also neurophysiological measures like EEG that give us a measure of the activity of those structures, and we can see how that changes developmentally as well. So the fact is, unless there's been a radical change in human biology recently, which is unlikely, then this kind of developmental pattern has probably been a characteristic of our species for a very long time.
And Associate Professor Nicholas Allen and colleagues are using fMRI brain scans to study the impact of family interactions on the structure of teenagers' brains, especially those prone to depression. A new study published this week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences offers further evidence for this pruning and refining of grey matter and the density of synapses across adolescence. Professor Erwin Feinberg from the University of California, Davis and colleagues have interestingly found that these changes are reflected in the brains of sleeping teens. And don't we know how much teens like to sleep? Using EEG or electroencephalogram recordings to measure brain electrical activity during sleep, they've tracked two groups of children from puberty for 5 years. They've found that the activity of two particular brainwave frequencies during sleep drops dramatically, more than 60%. Called delta and theta waves, their activity is strongly related to age.
These changes are huge, and they are changes in the power of the EEG waves in these frequencies. And there is between a 60 and 70% decline in power in these brain waves over this 5-year period.
The team have found that theta waves start decreasing from as early as 6 years old, but both delta and theta waves start to plummet from age 11. Why? Well, Erwin Feinberg and his colleagues have mapped this drop onto the corresponding decline in the density of synapses in different parts of the brain during adolescence. They think this later drop in delta waves links to the thinning of the frontal cortex in teens, that executive rational part of our brain. Remember that in kids there's an explosion of synaptic connections between brain cells, and in teens these are pruned.
And the amount of delta wave activity is an indicator of sleep recuperation.
And I guess, there is an argument that teens need more sleep.
Well, what's happening with teens, they are getting less of the most restorative component of sleep, and that is the biological change. That is the decline in delta and theta. And they need to adapt to that, and so they're sleepy a good part of the time.
How might these changes going on in the teenage sleeping brain across these years influence a teen's behaviour during the day?
Well, I think we can only speculate about that. In the most general sense, the teens need to adapt to a changing brain. So the very organ that allows adaptation is itself changing. There have been many scientists who have emphasized that the frontal cortex, the most evolutionarily advanced part of our brain, that is the last to develop. One point that we made in our paper, that the delta waves and the delta power that we're measuring is maximum in the front part of the brain. So we think we are getting a index, particularly of the brain maturation of the most advanced part of the brain.
But I guess that still doesn't get us really any closer to understanding the cause of certain teenage behaviour.
It does not directly explain teenage behavior. What people like to say, and I think this is still metaphorical, is that the scent is of rational control of emotional impulses. that those parts of the brain are not fully developed, and that is why impulsive behavior and risk-taking is greater among adolescents. But that's an extrapolation, and it has not been proved. And the data that we're getting provides some guidelines for where to look and when to look.
Professor Erwin Feinberg. But Dr. Robert Epstein is even more sceptical about over-interpreting the results of teen brain studies. He's former editor-in-chief of the magazine Psychology Today, and in his latest book, The Case Against Adolescence, Rediscovering the Adult in Every Teen, he argues we chronically infantilise teens.
Well, first of all, there's very little research on the adolescent brain. We're talking about a handful of studies, and all they show is that the teen brain in some very small respects is different from that of children or different from that of adults. But again, the same is true of the brain of 30-year-olds versus the brain of 50-year-olds versus the brain of 70-year-olds. So that doesn't tell you why they behave as they behave. And the fact is that teen turmoil is completely absent in more than 100 cultures around the world. They don't even have a term for the period of life we call adolescence. There's not even a name for it. The teen brain idea is fraudulent. It is promoted, some people believe, by drug companies, because drug companies want you to believe that your teen's turmoil is the result of a faulty brain, and the only way to fix it is with a drug. And as of about 3 or 4 years ago, we passed a terrible threshold. We're now prescribing more psychoactive drugs for teens than all other prescription drugs combined, and that includes acne medication and antibiotics. Our view of teens and is so distorted by what we see around us, by the media, by movies, that we just can't seem to think outside of that box. But the fact is, if you look around the world, you look in history, no question whatsoever, the turmoil we see is entirely a creation of our culture.
The teenager, a cultural construction. Robert Epstein points to anthropological data and research across more than 180 cultures gathered over the last half-century or so. What we think of a teenager in the West isn't universal, he argues. We're denying them the rightful claim to adulthood at puberty by extending education, not allowing them to work, and legally defining them as juveniles. This wasn't always the case.
We treat them very badly. We infantilize them, heavily restrict their activities, cause them great distress, so obviously we're not going to see them necessarily at their best. You can't really get perspective on this until you look at history before these restrictions existed, or unless you look at teens in other cultures.
Although, all of this is pretty speculative too. We really don't know our ancient past or even our most recent past. If you consider the 1950s and even before, teenagers were much more repressed. You have to look at the boarding school system in Victorian England, for example.
Well, again, that simply is not true. In fact, laws that specifically singled people out for committing certain crimes under a certain age, those are quite recent historically. And what I found was that there were virtually no such laws in the 1600s. Where they really start to increase in frequency is in the late 1800s, which is the time of industrialization. And of course, it's industrialization that ended the apprentice system and that basically began to push young people out of the workforce into mandatory schooling. So that's when the laws really start to increase. In fact, the rate began to increase dramatically after 1960. According to my own survey data, teens in the U.S. are subjected to 10 times as many restrictions as our mainstream adults, to roughly twice as many restrictions as active duty United States Marines, and to about twice as many restrictions as incarcerated felons. That's a new phenomenon in history.
I think he's partially got a very good point, which is that cultural and environmental factors do have a very big and profound influence on the way people develop. However, I do think you can't ignore biology. And if it's been shown, as it has, that there are important developmental changes occurring in the brain, biological changes that we know are important in terms of behaviour, then it's very likely that they too will have an influence. So I wouldn't disagree that the environment is a very powerful factor, and that in fact the way we treat adolescents and the environments that we create for them are going to have a big impact on their well-being.
More than power, never.
All in the Mind on ABC Radio National and across the world on Radio Australia and as podcast. I'm Anita Barrow. Today, scientific controversy over teenage brains.
Make it, do it, makes us.
Some people say that true love lasts forever. Do you agree with them? Yes. Not that I would know. High grades in school pay off with better salaries and more opportunities. Do you agree? I guess so. Is it true that both males and females masturbate? That's embarrassing.
Okay, fair enough. Here's a question about handling responsibility. Do you accept the blame when you make a mistake?
Yes, kind of do.
When things get tough, do you tend to give up?
No.
A 14 and 16-year-old braving a competency test titled How Adult Are You? It's a carefully constructed questionnaire by Dr. Robert Epstein and his colleague Diane Dumas, testing a wide range of adult competencies like knowing things about risk, sex, love, citizenship and so on. So far, about 30,000 people have completed the survey. Most teenagers, he says, score just as well as adults. And 30% of them even perform better than half the adult population.
What's interesting is that adults estimated that teens would score 48%. So there's a very dramatic misperception there about teen capabilities. We also gave teens a test of psychopathology, and we found that the more restrictions that teens were subjected to, the more signs they showed of psychopathology. That's not definitive, it doesn't prove my case, but it's very, very suggestive. And again, if you look at my own research and put it together with a lot of other data, you arrive, I think, inescapably at the conclusion that we are causing teen turmoil. We need to provide avenues for young people to enter the adult world. They used to do it through the apprentice system or through marrying quite young, at least females did. But now we need to find more modern ways of allowing young people to enter the adult world, and that means probably giving them various kinds of competency tests, just as we give tests to people who want to drive an automobile, and allowing young people to take tests showing they are competent to sign contracts or own property or start a business or leave school or whatever it may be, or become completely emancipated. And if we provided those opportunities, they would try by the millions to pass those tests and enter the adult world because they don't like being stuck in that idiotic world of teen culture any more than we like observing them in that world. They don't like being in there. I think within a couple of years, you would see the end of adolescence because they know how silly and frustrating their lives are stuck in that world.
Robert Epstein arguing that the wayward behaviour of teens isn't about brain biology, but the diminished expectations we have of them in the 21st century.
I certainly don't agree with that point of view. Clearly adolescents are not children. However, to argue that they are identical to adults, that they have exactly the same competencies as adults, flies in the face of a lot of evidence. It's difficult to say, because it's hard to do the experiment, what would happen if we just suddenly started to give them adults' rights and responsibilities.
Well, Robert Epstein's claim is that within a couple of years we would have adults and children. There would be no teen years.
Clearly adolescents have significantly more capability than younger children. Clearly the aspects of their development that are still developing are more subtle, if you like, and less fundamental than those in children. So, for example, they're learning about relationships with other people. They're learning how to manage their emotions. They're learning how to work towards a long-term goal that perhaps is a very significant goal, but that has many steps that you have to take towards it and needs to be planned for. So all these things that we associate with being able to function in our modern society, they are the exact areas where adolescent development is occurring most profoundly. And so that means that they also need certain cultural and environmental structures that will help them to develop safely until they are ready to fully take on those more adult roles.
And contrary to Robert Epstein's argument that adolescence is new, Associate Professor Nick Allen believes that adolescence has a deep evolutionary and cultural heritage.
When humans evolved, it's likely that they existed in small kin-based bands, hunter-gatherer bands of communities. And so everyone's behaviour was much more regulated by the cultural norms of this small group, and of course the fact that there was literally biological relatedness between most of the people there. So a young person entering adolescence would have a period during which of courtship and mating that they would go into. But nevertheless, the having of children was not occurring in this kind of nuclear family framework, but it was rather occurring within this very extended framework of parents and grandparents, and child rearing was shared across these various members of the community. So that the young person, despite the fact that they'd started having children, was still given quite a lot of support and was, if you like, receiving the benefit of quite a lot of the wisdom and the regulation of the community as a whole, and particularly their elders. Now, this is quite a different situation from the standard model of leaving home to get married and have children in our society, which really requires the assumption of very adult roles. For example, being able to support yourself financially, being able to maintain an independent home, being able to raise children without so much direct support, perhaps from grandparents and other extended family members. So I think that although we can see that sexual maturity occurs fairly early in adolescence, the kind of neurobiological maturity that's probably required in order to fully function as an adult doesn't occur until much later, and the various cultural changes that we've had in our society means that it's often more adaptive to wait until you've reached that kind of biological maturity and the assumption of those adult roles until you have children. In different societies in the past, that may not have been so important.
One thing I feel quite strongly about is many people sort of think that teenagers are a sort of modern cultural creation of the developing world. But if you actually look back in literature, people have been writing about teenagers as if they're a species apart almost for a very long time. Things like Romeo and Juliet, and even people like Homer and Virgil, they'd write little plots or subplots for teenagers who do these foolish, impetuous, mad things, which, to be honest, if they were adults and they'd done them, everybody just think they were stupid. But because they're teenagers, it makes it a tragic story.
University of Cambridge anatomist David Bainbridge has a new book out in Australia this week. It's called Teenagers, A Natural History. He argues adolescence is the defining life stage for humanity, now and throughout our evolution. It's designed to prepare us biologically for the Herculean responsibilities of adulthood.
I mean, we've been evolving, as Homo sapiens for about probably 250,000 years. It's only really in the last 9,000 years that we've even been living probably in settled agricultural communities. So I think quite a lot of the trouble we may see nowadays is because society doesn't fit in with how, well, any of the human race evolved, but I think this is especially true of teenagers.
But I must say that I have a slight resentment with your thesis that we are put on this earth to look after our teenagers.
Teenagers and children. The thing that is important under Darwinian natural selection is how many successful offspring you produce. And then once that's done, it does appear that natural selection doesn't act on you very much after that. And you see this again and again in animals. They get past the main reproductive age, and natural selection doesn't act on them nearly as much. The people who are evolving are the young people, I'm afraid. Teenagers, because they're young, developing, and also they're the ones who are breeding. I just think all the evidence would point towards them being the most important one. It doesn't mean natural selection is not acting on older people at all, but only in as much as it helps them support younger people. But the thing I really wanted to emphasise in the book is I do think there's a central biological core of what it means to be a teenager. Culture and society may change around it, but the biological core of being a teenager will still be the same. But the main reason for developing the second decade of life in humans was to allow for this tremendous maturation of the brain, which really is the thing, of course, which sets us apart. You can always criticise neuroscience data, the scans and things like that, by saying that we haven't yet got the direct link between changes in the brain and changes in behaviour. But I find it very unlikely that the brain is just this plastic thing which really it surely can't be a coincidence that all different teenagers in all different conditions go through such a tremendously stereotyped pattern of development and go through many of the same changes in behaviour when they're teenagers, documented throughout history and also across different cultures. I mean, obviously how teenagers behave in different cultures, they do differ, but that's because the culture and society is treating them differently. I do think that the sort of core of what's going on inside the teenagers, I think that is kind of pretty much preset.
Dr. David Bainbridge, author of Teenagers, A Natural History, published by Portobello. This argument that the lengthy adolescence of Homo sapiens is all about allowing for brain maturation isn't one that Robert Epstein buys.
This idea that the brain takes 20 years to develop is just ridiculous. The brain changes throughout life. I actually cite one study about changes in the corpus callosum, which is a huge structure connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. And the corpus callosum continues to change in a nice, orderly fashion throughout life. In fact, most of the brain does. So it's just ludicrous for someone to say, oh, well, it grows in a certain way for 20 years, and it's just ludicrous. And the changes that occur in part through some sort of developmental programming, and they occur in large part because of how we live and how we are treated and how we feel and so on. That's a major determinant of structural and functional changes in the brain. It's just not useful to talk about this issue in the context of brain research, in my opinion.
He's absolutely right that the brain is developing across the lifespan, but that doesn't mean it's always just a straight linear process. There are periods which are particularly significant and particularly rapid, and which are therefore developmentally sensitive. If there's anything that impacts on development in a negative way, it's probably going to have a more powerful impact at that stage of life than it is during another stage of life when the development is not so rapid. It's likely that the particular complexity of the human brain has required this very long period of development, and that has required so many things that are critical about our culture and our society, like, for instance, the amount of effort and energy that we put into child rearing, and all the cultural institutions and family institutions and things that exist around that have possibly been a result of the requirement to develop such a complex and highly articulated brain.
We should take into account, I think, many teenagers are particularly vulnerable because of these changes. However, for example, how this deals with how accountable a teenager should be, when to give them responsibility, how to hold them accountable when they don't fulfill their responsibilities, we have no clue from the biology. These are vexing problems that people have different attitudes toward, and our data on the brain changes do not tell us how you should do it.
Well done, 81%. That means you probably could be classed as an adult. How do you feel about that?
I'm not an adult.
But you scored very well. It means you're a very competent person.
No test is going to tell you if you're an adult or not. People can be 26 and still not be an adult, if you know what I mean.
Do you think you should have more responsibilities than you have now?
No, I don't reckon I should really, because I can't really trust myself of getting something and then holding responsible for it. Just kind of just forget about it, and then something bad happens to it.
And thanks to Nick and Lish for being guinea pigs on the radio for us. And before then, Professor Nick Allen from the Origin Youth Health Research Centre and Professor Erwin Feinberg from the University of California, Davis, both speaking to producer Anita Barrow. More info, downloadable audio and the blog for your comments. Go for it via abc.net.au/rn/allinthemind. My thanks to studio engineer Melissa May. I'm Natasha Mitchell. Next week, the controversial author of the 1961 epic The Myth of Mental Illness.
Never over.
On the Health Report, after the worst bushfires in Australian history and after a bad week for Australian soldiers in Afghanistan, the tragic loss of life hides a huge issue: the psychological wounds that people suffer from the stress. Why do some people have disabling symptoms long term while others don't? Plus a chance to hear the whole story about 2 major trials into prostate cancer screening released this week. That's with me, Norman Swan, and if you want to hear all this, download a podcast of the Health Report from Radio National's website.